And thank you again, everyone, for joining us for today's research webinar, Wildfire Impacts on Water Infrastructure. Before we get started, we would like to take a moment briefly to acknowledge that today is the 23rd anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks, where 2,977 people perished in the 2001 attacks at the World Trade Center site, the Pentagon, and aboard Flight 93. We thank the first responders who courageously answered the call to help that day and every day since. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our EPA presenters, Bill Platten, Samantha Bishop, and Levi Halpert. Bill Platten is an environmental engineer in EPA's Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water, where he helps drinking water systems monitor for and respond to drinking water contamination. His current focus is on response, decontamination, and recovery for contamination in both drinking water distribution systems and premise plumbing. He holds a BS in Civil and Environmental Engineering and an MS and PhD in Environmental Engineering from the University of Cincinnati. Samantha Bishop is an environmental engineer with EPA's Region 9, serving the U.S. Pacific Southwest. Samantha supports oversight of public water systems in Nevada and Hawaii, is the regional point of contact for disaster-resilient water infrastructure, and a regional staff lead for the Water Reuse Action Plan. Samantha has a BS in Environmental Engineering from University of Southern California and an MS in Environmental Engineering from Stanford University. And finally, our last speaker is Levi Halpert, who is a physical scientist in EPA's Office of Research and Development Center for Environmental Solutions and Emergency Response. His current research interests include modeling ion exchange filter performance and studying transport of contaminants and polymers. Levi earned his PhD in chemistry from Purdue University. And now I will turn it over to Samantha to kick things off for us. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you very much. Welcome. Thank you for being here, and thank you to our hosts at the Office of Research and Development. My name is Samantha Bishop, and I will be co-presenting this first presentation today with my colleague, Bill Platten. We're here to talk to you today about the Maui wildfire drinking water response. Bill and I were both deployed throughout the response since fall of 2023 as technical experts, and while there's no way we'll be able to cover a whole year of content, we are happy to take any questions at the end. I want to start by giving a sense of the scale of impact we were looking at with these wildfires. On August 8th, 2023, wind-fueled wildfires on the island of Maui destroyed more than 2,000 structures and caused billions in damages. There were fires in Upcountry, Kula, and Olinda, outside Kihei, and in Lahaina. The most significantly impacted area was the historic district of Lahaina, where more than 100 lives were lost. The Biden administration committed from the beginning to doing everything in its power to help Maui recover and rebuild the way the people of Maui want, while respecting sacred lands, cultures, and traditions. And shortly after August 8th, FEMA tapped the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to provide direct federal assistance. And part of that work was with the County of Maui Department of Water Supply to evaluate drinking water impacts and assist the Department of Water Supply in ensuring that drinking water was available when Lahaina residents were able to return to their homes. Bill will be talking today about EPA's role in its development over time in just a few slides. The most pressing concern at the onset of the response was to assess the damage to the drinking water system. We suspected from experience with previous fires that damage could be extensive given the number of structures that were burned, and a systematic approach was immediately employed to assess the system. Using a root cause analysis approach here and kind of starting where the water begins. But fortunately, the fires did not impact any major drinking water treatment infrastructure or water sources. However, distribution impacts were observed at both damaged water systems in Upper Kula, where there are 18 structures damaged, and the water system in Lahaina, where over 2,000 structures were damaged. Both systems also experienced pressure loss and therefore possible contamination. The Department of Water Supply responded efficiently and immediately by isolating and repressurizing the system where they were not leaking water. A few highly impactful actions happened in the early days that are worth highlighting. The County of Maui Department of Water Supply issued an unsafe water advisory for parts of Lahaina and Upper Kula on the 11th as a precautionary measure. DWS also provided water buffaloes that are pictured here, and they immediately removed all meters to disconnect the properties from the service laterals and began sampling. Initial sampling locations included the entry point to the distribution system, again, kind of starting where the water starts, and service mains to determine the location of any contamination across the distribution system. DWS sampled at hydrants and standpipes near the burn structures, and sampling also occurred at service connections of burn structures to determine if there's any potential contamination for rebuilding residents. The staff at Hawaii Department of Health were very involved throughout. They provided training and assistance, collecting samples alongside both DWS and EPA staff. These maps you see show an overview of the Lahaina and Upper Kula drinking water systems under the unsafe water advisory. On the left map is Lahaina. It's subdivided in this image into the hydraulically applicable areas, and at the time of this screen capture, it was colored orange to indicate that most of these areas were under an unsafe water advisory. The center is the larger map of Maui, so you can see in the northwest corner, that's the Lahaina areas, and in central Maui, that's Upper Kula. The rightmost map is zooming in on Upper Kula, where you can see in this screenshot that the areas where had an unsafe water advisory lifted, and that's why they were colored green. After the initial effort, Department of Water Supply took steps to recover the system. They strategically closed valves to hydraulically isolate areas to ensure areas could be sampled with a cascading approach. In this way, once an area was sampled and confirmed unimpacted, only known water quality was then entering the area. DWS also skillfully employed the use of an overland bypass to connect two of those minimally impacted areas with a low number of burn structures or no burn structures that would have otherwise been connected in the water system through an area with many burn structures. This allowed them to essentially hydraulically isolate and assess these areas, and they also opened small areas slowly to identify open lines and leaks and flush the areas sufficiently. From the beginning, they also developed a flow chart and a sampling and analysis plan to guide the effort in a logical fashion. This was a tall order in the first days of the response. A sampling and analysis plan should identify target contaminants, sample collection protocols, sampling locations. It should have aspects of data quality and management, and the plan should account for a potentially large number of samples that could be collected over an extended period, possibly months, a year, depending on the extent of fire damage and if contamination is found. They also had to account for the wide range of scenarios encountered in each of those hydraulically isolatable areas. So pressure loss, no pressure loss, damaged structures, no damaged structures. Could it be hydraulically isolated or not? And assess the scenario of each isolated area, proceed with a sampling plan based on that scenario. These conditions all factored into where and how they sampled, and eventually the requirements to lift the unsafe water advisory. After the initial sampling effort, the Department of Water Supply got that sampling and analysis plan approved to guide the effort for the remainder of the year. The protocol for sample collection was critical for determining the presence and extent of contamination. The sampling efforts included chlorine and total coliform testing. These helped determine if the pressure loss impacted the system and if contaminants were present, as well as testing for VOCs and SVOCs to ascertain potential damage from the fire. The Department of Water Supply proceeded with multiple rounds of sampling for the mains around the distribution system, and this helps determine if potential contamination was localized or systemic. For the service lateral sampling, and this is around the distribution system, at damaged structures, because VOCs can leach out of some materials over time, a period of stagnation was incorporated into the sampling protocol. DWS chose a conservative stagnation period of 72 hours, and this long period sort of allows for larger quantities of contaminants to potentially enter the water, thus increasing the likelihood of detection during analysis and potentially providing greater confidence in the results. We also found it was very important that samples be collected by individuals who'd been properly trained on the sampling protocol, and QA/QC and chain of custody all played critical roles in the response. So we know we had that stagnation period, they had that sampling plan, but what was contamination? The Department of Water Supply chose to use the lowest possible standard for contamination, considering contamination anything above detection, even if it was below the MCL. Built into the sampling plan were a series of then possible corrective actions depending on where a detect was found. So these could include flushing water mains and or replacing hydrants, resampling for the distribution sample system, or isolating and or replacing service laterals. In some small cases, there were capital improvements that we could hydraulically isolate so no sampling was conducted in these locations. but in general, that was the process that was followed in the sampling and analysis plan. I'm now going to hand it over to my colleague, Bill Platten, to talk about how EPA integrated into this response.
At the beginning of the response, EPA got involved almost immediately with through the Region 9 Water Division. They began providing support to the Department of Health, Safe Drinking Water Branch, as well as the county. From my part, from the Office of Water, we support all the regional offices in these kinds of circumstances, and I joined in with Region 9's effort when they started to provide support. A couple of days after EPA got involved through the region, FEMA issued a mission assignment to EPA under ESF3 Public Works and Engineering to support water and wastewater with preliminary damage assessments and technical assistance. EPA staff advised the Department of Health and the county on impacts from the wildfire response, sampling procedures, the sampling plan development, and on communications with the public. Specifics we got into were the nature of the contamination, how it would occur from the fire, the specifics of the sampling methods, including stagnation and why it was necessary. Staff also reviewed the system, the plans and hydraulics to assess for potential impacts and helped select locations for the sampling effort. By January, Department of Water Supply had cleared all of the Upper Kula system and lifted the unsafe water advisory up there. And many of the areas in the Lahaina system that were outside of the burn zone, they prioritized returning service to areas that had many standing structures and where people were living and working. In February, EPA received another mission assignment to begin direct support for the sampling, analysis, and service lateral isolation for the remaining areas in the burn zone. EPA was working in a support role to the county. County was ultimately still the decision maker on the sampling effort and any decisions on remedial actions. In total, EPA sampled 135 hydrants across the system and 1,308 service laterals. Of the service laterals, 589 were isolated by EPA and 169 were isolated by the county. There were two primary reasons to perform a lateral isolation. One was that contamination was found through the sampling effort. Also, a number of laterals were found to be damaged and they could not be sampled in following the protocol. And in that case, it was assumed that they could be contaminated, and so they were isolated if they were damaged in any way. The county also would make individual decisions about certain areas that they wanted to expedite getting clearance for. And so in some cases, even without sampling, they just made decisions to isolate those properties from the rest of the distribution system. Sampling did take a little bit of time, and in some cases that expedience was more important. So in total, EPA completed its support at the end of July, and the county was able to lift the unsafe water advisory for the remainder of Lahaina on August 2nd. This is an overall timeline of the response for the drinking water. The county was able to start clearing areas about a month and a half into the incident in September, and they finished that just before November. In Upper Kula and Lahaina, they were able to start clearing areas in October and completed all of Lahaina in August. And I also want to point out here that this is just a drinking water response. There were several other EPA actions going on for household hazardous waste, wastewater sewer inspection, and sustainability concurrent with all of this work. So as you can imagine, we faced a number of challenges in implementing this response. First is just existing system conditions. The infrastructure was old. Things like valves didn't always work. Sometimes we'd go out and the valve would be turned and it wouldn't hold. The island's also water challenged overall. There were two separate systems on different parts of the island that both required attention. They were about an hour and a half drive apart from each other, and getting to both of them, you couldn't always send crews to both of them in a day to do the sampling. So it was a little bit of a logistics issue to get between them. The systems themselves had very complex hydraulics due to the island topography, a lot of elevation change between points in the system, understanding how the water moved through the system. They used a number of service laterals or dual service laterals where there was a single pipe leading to two properties. It would split and serve two separate meters. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but it led to complications with how to sample and collect representative samples for those lines. And then there were a number of master meters and that were feeding apartment complexes or HOAs that had their own distribution network on the property. Department of Health was very instrumental in facilitating communications with those property owners and building property managers to explain the circumstance. The county would go to the master meter and do the work that they needed to sample and test that line. And the state helped to explain the circumstances to the property managers and owners so that they could do what they needed to for their own premise plumbing system. Response logistics was also a very big challenge. As you can imagine, in an island in the Pacific, getting things to and from was quite difficult at times. There was not a laboratory on the island that could do VOC and SVOC analysis, so all of those samples had to be shipped to the mainland, which typically took 2 to 3, sometimes 4 days. Any delay in getting them off the island or delay in shipping on the mainland would lead to issues with the samples arriving too late and not making temperature at the laboratory, meaning they had to be resampled again in the field. Also, getting supplies to the island was very difficult. Initially, sampling supplies were not available, and getting them onto the island took time. And then sort of later on, trying to get hydrants and pipe that were used to replace parts of the system was difficult and in limited stock on the island as well. There were also some staffing challenges. DWS has a small staff, and they're actually responsible for 12 total water systems in Maui. So they had 10 other systems that they were having to do regulatory sampling for and maintenance and all the other things, while also trying to support the actions under the response. And it was very straining on them. EPA staff rotations, EPA employees were coming in on 2.5, 3-week rotations. And just the changeover of that and all the new faces coming in required a lot of communication with the staff, the county staff on the island to make sure that they weren't missing communication or losing contact. And then also we employed a number of cultural experts to help monitor the culturally sensitive areas with all of our field teams. And while that wasn't necessarily a staffing issue so much as we just had to incorporate them into our field teams and make sure that they were present with us during any field activities. And there were a number of sampling challenges, identifying damaged structures. In Lahaina, there were a lot of multi-structure properties. And so a property might be designated damaged and the front structure was still standing, but the back one wasn't, or vice versa. So working those issues was somewhat challenging. And then even on properties that were designated properly, locating the meters within the property was a challenge. Having to go out and explore on the property to see where that meter was. Our GIS information wasn't always accurate for that. So it took quite a bit to find where the meters were for some properties. Identifying structures that were sharing laterals. Again, I mentioned the dual lateral. We developed a sampling protocol for sampling that line if they were connected, but it wasn't always clear which properties were actually connected using the same line. And so it was a challenge to know if we should use a single or a double sampling protocol for those properties. Ensuring the stagnation times and following the sample protocol for the VOCs and SVOCs was a challenge. And then lateral damage was also an issue for preventing the sampling. It wasn't always obvious the line was damaged, and you'd go to try and sample and find that it was leaking or something after the fact. And then for isolation, locating where the laterals connected into the mains was a challenge at times. And coordinating all of the operations. EPA had crews out doing the work, DWS had crews doing the work. We were coordinating on getting assigning who was doing which work, and DWS was also supporting EPA if we faced any challenges with the system as a whole. If a particular water main started leaking or there were other issues, they would come in and support our teams. This is a schematic and some images of the sampling apparatus and the dual lateral situation. You can see a single lateral fed to water meters, and initially samples were collected from both meters for VOCs, and then a single SVOC sample was collected. SVOCs are much larger volume than the VOCs. And so a single SVOC sample would be collected from the meters. When it became clear that we couldn't always identify which of those meters were connected like this, eventually we decided to just do a VOC and SVOC from each meter. And in either scenario, if one of the meters was found to have contamination, the lateral will be isolated and both meters would be removed from the system, disconnected from the system. Some of the images across the bottom, you can see these two meters are directly next to each other, a couple feet apart. Very obvious that those are connected. It wasn't always that easy. The apparatus would be installed. There's a couple of different configurations. And so the apparatus would have to be tailored to what kind of meter configuration it was. We raised up the port for flushing. You can see there's a large diameter port on there for flushing the line prior to the stagnation period, and then a candy cane that came off the top for collecting the SVOC and VOC samples. For lateral isolation, this is 3 scenarios we encountered in the field, just to give a flavor of what we were seeing. The image on the left is a very shallow, small diameter line that fed a number of properties down a lane. There weren't any corp stops on this line, and so we ended up having to trace it all the way back to the water main on the cross street and isolate the entire lane from that point. The middle image is a example of the coordination between EPA and Department of Water Supply. We went to isolate this line, found it next to a telephone pole, and it had been decided that anything that required some unique equipment that wasn't sort of part of the standard stuff that our field teams had, the Department of Water Supply would come in and handle that. And so this one would be assigned to the county to complete. And then on the right, this lateral came out and we excavated near where we thought it connects to the water main. Turns out that it turned right and went 50 feet to the right to another water main on a cross street. The water main that was on this street dead ended to the left of this image, about 75 feet away, and we did not realize that it would go that direction. So we had to do some exploring to find where it connected. Current status and what the future looks like. The town of Lahaina is still in recovery mode. They're still rebuilding. Same with the impacts in Upper Kula. So the county is doing long-term monitoring, still collecting some samples periodically to show that there's no more contamination in the system. They're operating the Lahaina system completely right now, but it has none of the water demand that it previously did. So they're having to take extra steps to ensure that the water quality is not degrading from no one using it. The long term, they're going to start replacing service laterals and connecting in the water meters as the structures are rebuilt and complete all their capital improvement projects that they've designated. And EPA received a recovery mission assignment for continued technical assistance and will be continuing to work with the county as they go through their recovery. Other sort of the things that have come out of this, we've shipped off some of the damaged hydrants to the EPA Office of Research and Development, who will start taking a look at them to see why some of the contamination was found. We'll also be conducting a larger meta-analysis of both Department of Water Supply's efforts and EPA's efforts, looking at contaminant occurrence, looking at the spatial and elevation differences and concentration ranges that we're seeing. And there's a lot of field notes that were collected throughout the operation. And we need to go through and compile them and develop some lessons learned that we can share with the greater community. If you're interested in some more information, either on this wildfire contamination topic or on the response in Maui, here's some links where you can find out some more information. All of the updates that the county has posted on the recovery and response and recovery is available on mauirecovers.org. And there's a lot of information about EPA's efforts at the EPA link. It includes the household hazardous waste removal, sustainability, and the water and wastewater. And finally, I just want to say thank you to all of the staff that were involved in this at the county. All the DWS employees were impacted by this and having to respond to it. Also the Department of Health, who helped do a lot of work and support the county with their response, and all the EPA employees. I think in total, for all those groups, there was like 450 employees or more that were involved in the drinking water response alone. And with that, thank you.
Hello, I'm Levi Hoppert, physical scientist at the US EPA. Can everybody hear me? Sure.
Yep, we can hear you.
All right, awesome. So yeah, thanks Bill and Samantha for that interesting presentation about the response in Maui. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about how EPA's Office of Research and Development provides the science that helps inform the decision-making for responses like that. And in particular, I'd like to talk about some of the issues related to the interactions of wildfire-associated contaminants with plastic drinking water pipes. See if I can, there we go. All right, so wildfire-associated contamination of drinking water systems isn't a problem unique to the response in Maui. There have been, in the past 10 years, several incidents where wildfires have left drinking water systems with contaminated infrastructure. And we've had a couple incidents in California and also one in Oregon where, for instance, benzene, a regulated contaminant and human carcinogen, is found in drinking water systems at or above or well above federal regulatory limits. And I would just like to say that, so one thing to point out is that the regulatory limit here is for system entry. It's actually a whole different can of worms about regulating contaminants at, like, for instance, premise plumbing. And we can talk to Office of Water about that some more, but we're going to talk about research in this presentation, which is one of the things that benzene does is that when it interacts with plastic materials, for instance, cross-linked polyethylene that is used in building water systems, or in high-density polyethylene, which you commonly find in service laterals. And for instance, this was pretty common in California, where corrosion resistance and earthquake resistance are really important. Benzene and some of the other wildfire-associated contaminants can permeate all the way through. They can pass through the walls of these kind of plastic pipes. And normally historically, that has been of great interest for pipes that are, for instance, buried next to leaking underground storage tanks. But it can also be a problem when VOCs like benzene are introduced to drinking water systems through disasters like wildfires, or even like spills or industrial backflow incidents. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the sort of interesting behaviors that benzene has when it does interact with plastic pipes. So when we're talking about something like benzene, and I'll use benzene as our example for most of the presentation, is that it can penetrate into the pipe walls. It doesn't just sit on the inner surface of, like, a service line or a PEX tubing in somebody's house. So since it can penetrate into the meat of the pipe, your plastic pipes that are exposed to benzene for a long time can act like sponges. They soak up the benzene and then can release it at a later time. And one important thing to keep in mind is that benzene movement through plastic is not very fast compared to, like, the time scale of some remediation and sampling activities. It only takes a couple minutes or seconds to flush water out of a pipe, but for a benzene molecule to pass from the inner surface of a pipe to like the outer skin of a pipe is like a days or weeks long process. So you can end up in a situation where, for instance, a contamination is identified and pipes are immediately flushed to, remove contaminated water. And then if a sample is taken immediately after that, it might come up a non-detect because the benzene or whatever contaminants are in the pipe didn't have time to leach back to the inner surface of the pipe to be released into water. And you might end up with recurring benzene hits in sites that have already been flushed or thought to be decontaminated. So now that we know why, like just sort of generally what the behaviors are and why we're concerned about it, we at ORD wanted to try to put numbers to that. Like, how do we quantify that? How much benzene comes out? How fast? So we wanted to use experiments to develop a model to help inform response actions, like how do we interpret some of our sampling results, and how can we design a decontamination project if that's the route that we choose to go. So actually, before the wildfires became an issue, Matthew Magnuson and I developed a permeation model for stagnant drinking water pipes. We were interested in looking at responses to oil spills or industrial backflow incidents. In fact, fairly recently, there was a industrial incident where some factory, I think in Texas, accidentally pumped some benzene back out into the drinking water system, and some homes were contaminated. So we developed a model that looks at the uptake and release in stagnant pipes. And stagnant pipes are a pretty, I think, understudied sort of from a modeling standpoint here. It's mostly, the literature before this was mostly concerned with like flowing water pipes, like water mains that are next to like gas stations or underground storage tanks. So we developed a model to look at stagnant pipes that are where they don't have flow in them all the time, such as like you would find in a building water system, or maybe even in service lines in wildfire affected areas, like immediately after response and recovery from wildfires, where people aren't using water all the time. And we tested and vetted this model on some model compounds in cross-linked polyethylene. And then we looked for ways to make it more applicable for common wildfire-associated incidents. So we also tested this on HDPE and benzene. And how we tested this at our testing and evaluation facility in Cincinnati is that we took some segments of drinking water pipe, filled them up with a contaminant solution containing significant amounts of benzene. And we've also done this for some of the other wildfire-associated contaminants. You seal both ends of the pipes and leave it sit with the contaminant solution inside for a couple weeks. This particular example is for 2, which is something that might happen if during a wildfire response, the contaminated water gets into service lines or houses, and then while there's an evacuation, it just sits with the contaminated water inside. And then after the contamination period, we dumped the contaminated water out into a waste container and measured the amount of benzene in it. And then every day we did daily flushing and sampling of the pipe segments and to observe the trends in the amount of benzene that leached out of the pipes. And I have some results plotted here comparing a couple different pipe materials. The orange curve, well, the orange dots show our samples from high density polyethylene pipes that you might find are commonly used in service lines. And one thing to note here is that the decrease in benzene concentrations with the daily flushes is not uniform, because we didn't flush the pipes on weekends or holidays. And so during those longer stagnation periods of 2 or 3 days, you can see that the benzene concentration that leached out is higher than the previous day. So that gives you an idea of like how slow the leaching process is and how important it is to consider stagnation time when interpreting sampling results. And also, I'd like to draw attention to, we checked these against metal pipes. This example has stainless steel, but we also did copper, which is a really common material for service lines and premise plumbing. And that, at least pristine metal pipes didn't hold up nearly as much benzene as in fact, it was pretty much non-detectable compared to the polyethylene pipes. So then after we had our experimental data, we applied our model to it to see if we were actually able to describe the real behavior. And our model was, as you can see, comparing these two curves here in the plot, our model was quite capable of capturing the behavior of the contaminants in the pipes during this flushing program. We only had two adjustable parameters in our model, and they both have physical meaning. The first of them is the partition coefficient, which is a measure of relatively how strongly absorbing are the contaminants into the pipe material versus how much do they want to be in the water. And then also the diffusion coefficient, which is a description of how quickly and like how agile are the contaminant molecules, how quickly can they diffuse through the polymer chains in the pipe wall. We tested these. We fit a bunch of different pipe sizes from pipes of different materials and from different manufacturers. We looked at high-density polyethylenes and a couple of sets of PEX tubing and a couple of pipes taken from field sites to see how much variability we saw in these parameters. And there was some, but it actually wasn't all that much. On these plots, I compare, like if you take the extreme values of the partition and diffusion coefficient and apply them to this sort of daily flushing routine that we did, there is some difference in the actual predicted concentrations, but it's on a scale that for this particular scenario doesn't really make much operational difference. Like if you look at these curves, it's probably not going to change. Like if you made predictions or you're interpreting your sampling or flushing performance based on, for instance, the wrong, the wrong size pipe, like within like one standard size, or you're looking at it within, maybe you're wrong about which kind of polyethylene it is, it's probably not going to make a huge difference for this particular experiment. So we think for stagnant water systems, this model is actually, and the parameters that we're publishing are actually fairly robust. But one potential caveat here is that we only looked at these at room temperature or on bench conditions. And premise plumbing in particular can have a pretty wide variation in what kind of water temperatures you might be looking at. For instance, there's in the wintertime, the service line, water coming in from the service line might be pretty cold. And then on the other hand, water coming out of a water heater can be pretty hot. So how does that affect how we understand sampling and decontamination of these plastic pipes? Well, for the partitioning, which again is how strongly absorbing the contaminants are in the plastic pipe. Here we have our example where we looked at a bunch of different premise plumbing relevant temperatures. There's not really a clear trend in, for instance, benzene strength of partitioning to the polymer. This actually isn't terribly surprising, but it's good to know. The diffusion effect is we expect it to be more significant because temperature, that affects how quickly all the molecules in the system are wiggling, and so like how quickly benzene can pass through polymer chains. So we ran this contamination and decontamination scenario I mentioned previously at these different temperatures. And if you look at the difference in the decontamination curves, it's not super simple. It's actually a little bit complex what's going on here, because there are a couple of competing effects that the more rapid diffusion at higher temperatures causes. Like you might initially expect there to be more benzene absorbed from the initial contamination effect, and there is, right? The pipe will take up more of the benzene that's in the initial contaminant solution during that the contamination scenario, and it does. But as you can see, even the initial extractions at the really high temperatures, like those initial data points are really low. Like there's not that much benzene, which seems paradoxical because the pipe absorbed way more benzene. But that's because at high temperatures, benzene goes all the way through the pipe wall, all the way to the outer surface, and starts evaporating more quickly. So there's another benzene loss mechanism. And I think it would be interesting to explore some of the implications of that potential loss mechanism. Like, is it going to be so much that if you get a really big, seriously contaminated pipes in a house, for instance, are the hot water lines going to end up causing the basement to have benzene fumes in it? That would be a interesting thing, I think, to look at. But also, the higher temperature also enhances the speed of other removal mechanisms, like so for potentially for flushing out hot water lines with hot water might potentially be more effective because, again, the benzene is moving more quickly out of the pipe wall and into the water in that case. With our current data set, we can't really untangle all of these effects, so we're really interested in continuing this work on pipes with different wall thicknesses to confirm that the model is getting that right. So sort of to sum up the modeling and diffusion in the plastic pipes, we have, I think, a pretty good handle now on, at least for stagnant pipes in premise plumbing and service lines, about how sort of pristine, like undamaged or really like plastic pipe that's in fairly good condition is going to behave. And we have parameters out there to help inform and decon decisions and interpret sampling. But there are still some unanswered questions, I think, about the bigger picture of like wildfire-associated contamination of pipes. First off, like, where does the contamination come from during wildfires? All right, some studies have already ruled out like releases from like storage tanks or that kind of thing. Like the contaminant profile in most of these drinking water incidents doesn't match underground storage tanks or like nearby industrial sources. So where's it coming from? Like, is it coming from destroyed infrastructure or from maybe burning biomass that gets drawn into the system if it's depressurized? And also, again, I've talked a lot about pristine plastic pipe, but for instance, fire-affected pipes out in the distribution system that may have been heated or got hot or got some other junk inside them. Like, for instance, this picture here from California's Division of Drinking Water showing a pipe with a bunch of other garbage in it. Like, could that also be deposited by wildfires and serve as a reservoir for contamination? And also, like with the response that Bill and Samantha talked about, there are some places where there are recurrent VOC or contaminant detections from metal pipes rather than plastic ones. So what's happening there? So we have an ongoing research project, a fairly new one, where we're looking at the effect of fire conditioning on drinking water pipes and how does that, what kind of contaminants get taken up into pipes from simulated wildfires, and how does the change of condition of the pipes affect like how they respond to like their uptake and release of these contaminants. And so to this end, we're doing this collaborative project with EPA's Region 9 and conditioning pipes at a burn facility in EPA's facility in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, where we're taking some wood fuels and building a fire and sending the hot gases and smoke through drinking water pipes to see if we can get some insight into the mechanism of contamination. And if the hope is that once we have a better understanding of why the contamination happens in the first place, we might be able to build some better countermeasures to help systems build resilience. Here's a schematic of our initial combustion chamber design, where we have a cast iron burner with a little propane burner, and that's just to get the wood fire started. And then on the next layer is our fuel source. We put enough wood in there to burn for about an hour. And then our combustion chamber, where the heat, hot gases, and smoke rise through, have a couple different levels of where we put pipe specimens at different distances from the fire so that they have a bit of a different temperature, so we can measure a couple different temperatures of exposure. And then we have sensors for to measure contaminants in the exhaust to the system, where we can compare the contaminants found in the smoke with contaminants later extracted from pipe to see if maybe we can identify any that are like uniquely generated in certain kind, might be uniquely generated in some kind of pipes. We've had to do some work to tune in how this system works, because we don't want to, if we make it so hot that we melt down the pipes completely, that might be interesting to answer the question of like what pipe conditions might show up in fires, but we won't be able to really do any decontamination experiments in the pipes, because like realistically, if the pipe can't hold water, it's going to be replaced. And so we had to tune the burner stack accordingly so that we don't melt the pipes completely or incinerate them. And so we have a revised design here. You can see this one's a little different from the first picture that I showed. It's got some extra heights on it, and we've adjusted the fuel composition so that it's not sending flames all the way through up the pipes. And so we've got a pretty good handle on this now, and we're expecting results from this project early next year. And I want to take a moment to thank the team that is working on this project. It takes a team to do research like this. And yes, thank you everyone for tuning in, and I think we'll go to questions now.
Yes, thank you, Levi, Bill, and Samantha for this great presentation. We do have quite a few questions, so let's go ahead and get started here. The first question is, can you please explain the trigger points for EPA to deploy or get involved with an incident?
I will do my best. The impacted community, in this case, Department of Water Supply, and the county request assistance from the state, and then the state makes a request from FEMA. In this case, it was a declared disaster, and FEMA was there, and FEMA then assesses the need and looks to issue a mission assignment. This isn't my area of expertise, so I apologize if that is incorrect for those that do know the proper method. For non-declared disasters, if this happens just sort of locally to a distribution system, the utility would work with their state primacy agency to try and resolve the issue. And in circumstances where the state needs assistance, they will reach out to their regional water division for support, and the EPA staff in the water divisions can contact the Office of Water for additional technical support in my group for contamination issues.
Great, thanks, Bill. The next few questions are regarding the sampling. How did DWS conduct the sampling? Did they use field kits or was it done in the lab? And also, what were the samples analyzed for?
Right, so we did chlorine in the field when the sample was collected using colorimetric or test strips. Then total coliform samples were collected and taken to the county's laboratory on the island for them to perform that analysis. And then the VOC and SVOC samples were collected in the field, but the samples were shipped off to the mainland to different laboratories for the analytical work. They were done using standard EPA methods.
Thanks. Next question is, are the sampling plans and procedures available to other utilities for planning efforts?
The county did share their sampling and analysis plan. I believe it's posted to the Maui Recovers website in the water area. I don't have a link offhand to share, but you should be able to go to that website and find it. Thanks,
Bill. The Maui Recovers website is in the chat for folks if they need it. The next question is, in terms of sampling, what is the rationale for including volatile organic compounds and semi-volatile organic compounds rather than the total organic carbon or turbidity?
So They're looking for specific contaminants with using those methods. We don't truly understand which are the most prevalent that occur from this just yet. That's why Levi's work is so important. I don't know if TOC would be a good indicator of that. It would capture just anything that might be contaminant, dirt, other chemicals that might not be a concern, organic matter. So I don't know that that would be a good test to implement. It's something that could be researched along with some of the other chemical methods to see if it's a good assessment, instead of doing the specific analysis. Levi covered a little bit of why those the VOCs are showing up. And because we don't truly understand what is the best chemical to test for in these circumstances, the county decided to expand beyond just the VOCs and also performed SVOC analysis.
Thanks. The next question is, earlier on, you mentioned that the island is water challenged overall. What did you mean by that?
So they have limited sources of water on the island. I don't know the overall circumstances of this, of what their challenges are, but I do know in the Upper Kula area, pretty soon after they were cleared, they actually institute a water conservation effort because they were it was a very dry season and they were starting to run out of water. I don't recall how long that was in place, but just in general, where these are where these systems were located on the island, there's a limited water supply for them.
Thanks. If you can you discuss the differences in wildfire response between what occurs in the Western states versus the case in Hawaii?
I don't know that there is a significant difference. I think each state has different protocols that they've been following. California, Oregon, Colorado. In general, I think they're all about the same. I don't know. It is a bit of a learning curve for the last several years as this has happened. So for instance, the Paradise in Santa Rosa, where this sort of originated, it was done very differently. We've had a lot of lessons learned since then, and this is the way this response was done was very informed by all of those that have occurred previously.
The next question is, did the water systems have any type of emergency response plans before the fires occurred?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if they had a full emergency response plan in place when these occurred, if the county did.
Next question is, do you have an indication of how long the VOC and SVOC contamination may persist in lines?
That's as Levi kind of explained, it's a little bit complicated. There's a lot of factors that go into that: the material, the pipe, how bad the contamination was. Levi, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, sure. You're completely right about that. Yeah, so like the history of the pipe and how severe the contamination makes a huge difference. And like for some of the pipes in California that even had, repeated decontamination efforts, they were still showing VOC, like benzene, like months later.
Next question is, can you explain how does the benzene get into the water pipes after an emergency?
Yeah, we don't know for certain. There's two hypotheses. One is that when the structure is burning and the water line becomes impacted, it gets exposed to the burning structure. If there's depressurization, that can suck in contaminated water, can suck in gases and smoke and soot from the burning structure, and that can enter the line. If there are any plastic components in the line, they could melt and also be sucked into the line. So those are the two general hypotheses about where the source of the stuff is coming from. There's one of the resources I shared on one of my last slides has a fact sheet about this and has a little bit more detail that you can explore if you're interested.
Thanks, Phil. Next question is, was there any assessment of private well cisterns stored water that wasn't part of the DWS system?
I don't know how much drinking water there was that wasn't part of the systems. I do know that within Lahaina, there are a number of wells that are primarily used for irrigation. And I believe that those were all inspected. It was not part of the work that we were involved with. So I don't know the process or the resolution to that, but I do know that that was was brought up during the response overall.
Great. The next question is, that was a difficult and complex water recovery effort. Were there any waterborne illnesses following all of that work?
None that I'm aware of. Part of the process of this was to make sure that the lines had been flushed thoroughly, and the total call form was an indicator for any general contamination, biological contamination in the line. So by doing that testing, that showed that the lines had been remediated sufficiently, and there was chlorine residual in the lines to prevent any waterborne pathogens from persisting and causing illnesses. But I have not heard one way or the other if there were problems.
This question, I believe, is for Levi. How much does scale or mineral deposits on the inner surface of the plastic pipe slow down or prohibit the leaching?
Oh, that's a really good question. So none of the pipes that we looked at in this work had seriously developed a mineral scale, and I'm not sure actually how much mineral scale you end up with most of these service lines and premise plumbing. But that would be a really interesting opportunity for research, I think. And like biofilm also might influence how much like for instance benzene comes into and out of a pipe. So like that would be another good research topic.
And I think here we're going to have our last question right now as we are at the top of the hour. And I think Levi, this is for you as well, but Bill and Samantha, please. Also, are there any studies where wildfire impacts surface water changing its chemical composition?
Actually, I can take that. So there's the fire itself, I don't believe directly impacts the water, but when you damage the watershed from the fire, that can change the runoff that's coming into whatever the source water is, and that can change the chemical composition of that. I think there's some indications that it can have a short-term impact, but also a long-term impact. It's not been fully studied. There's a couple of research papers out there that looked at it. It's something that I think needs to be explored a little bit more to see what the particularly long-term impacts might be. Short-term, we have seen problems with systems that the turbidity becomes very high after the fire, and they can no longer actually filter and treat their water for use because there's so much turbidity in the water.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you, Levi, and thank you, Samantha. There's a lot of appreciation for all the work that you all have done here in the comments. So thank you all for the work. Thank you for presenting. And with that, we will end.